Hi, my name is Nathan Reidinger. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland. This is joint work I did with my colleagues, Bruce, Blaise, and Michelle. Today's talk is about online tracking, and in particular, user perceptions of the online tracking environment. We're tracked all across the internet. We're given cookies, maybe our browsers are being fingerprinted, you name it, we're probably tracked by it. And this happens because advertisers would like to serve us relevant ads, and tracking is a necessary part of that. So what we'd like to do in this paper is provide transparency about that process and then see how users feel about it. In fact, this is not necessarily a new idea. Back in 2019, my colleague had done exactly this. They built a browser extension, I'll refer to it as TT1. TT1 tracks users across the web and then displays that tracking to them in a visualization of this tracking of their behavior and then assesses their perceptions of that. And what these researchers found, somewhat surprisingly, was that even though users were impacted, their privacy perceptions were affected, it may not have been as galvanizing as you would think. So privacy perceptions increased a little bit, but we're wondering why not more? So what if we created a creepy version of TT1 where we can potentially move the needle on privacy perceptions? And I'll preview some of the ways that we're going to do that before I talk about our visualizations and our methods and our results. So when a user visits a web page, they're given text, and that text can be bucketed into ad categories. This is something that TT1 did. It takes this text and it uses a classifier to produce an ad category. But what we do differently here is that we look to Google's content classification API to do that same process. And what this does is it gives us access to nearly 1,000 different attributes that a user can then be associated with to give you a pretty good sense of how a tracker might view you, right? Additionally, we wanted to capture the ads that participant sees. And for this, we capture the entire DOM. And then we also fetch outgoing links like the why this ad link to give you some sense of why the advertiser says you got this ad. And also we fetch the outgoing hyperlink to the final destination of the ad to give us a sense of what content is this ad about. And we use that same content classifier on that final destination. Finally, we wanted to pull in additional data sources. So here we're looking to Google's, it used to be called Ad Settings, it's now called My Ad Center. And that's a way of Google showing you all of the different attributes that is associated with you. And so if a user is logged into Google and they have ad personalization turned on, then we automatically fetch that data and grab it in the extension. So we were looking at using this data in a revised version of TT1, and we wanted to understand how we can create creepy visualizations. So for this, we used 27 different prototypes, and we feature tested these with participants in a video survey. There were 13 participants. This was IRB approved. And from that, we learned which visualizations were worthwhile to develop. We ended up with 10 visualizations. And to give you a sense of what these visualizations looked like in the extension, so one of the potentially uncomfortable things that trackers might do is observe when you're browsing late at night and then try and use that information to estimate your bedtime. So we can observe the time that a user is visiting a website and then just log this and look for this peak of when the user is engaged late at night and then when they drop off, inferring a bedtime. We also wanted to look into the differences between certain interests. So interests are not all created alike, and companies know this. And we wanted to present that type of difference to users as well. So what we have is in the center, this bubble chart of the domains that are associated with potentially sensitive interests. Interests like medical data or something, right? And we also have a word cloud from the web pages that were tagged with that interest. And then we're presenting this information to the user and saying these are some potentially sensitive interests that a tracker might think you have. Additionally, we use that Google data by looking at the breadth and the depth of attributes that Google is associating with users. So we put this in a tree structure, allowing us to show that breadth and depth. For example, this is many layers deep, and maybe this person is having an interest in babies and toddlers. And so we can see that it's very deep and very wide in this chart. Finally, the ad information that we're collecting, we pull all of this together in an aggregate and present one of our visualizations is the ad served overview. So we're showing participants what are the ad categories that you've been seeing based on that content classification. and which of these are sensitive, which of these are common, how many ads have you seen, and if you had clicked on each ad that you were served, how much would that cost an advertiser in an estimated fashion? Okay, so we have these 10 new visualizations that we developed, but we also wanted to create a creepy version of TT1. And so we needed to compare TT2 to TT1. And that's where these two conditions, T1 dashboard and T2 everything, are versions from the old extension. The methods that we use to investigate this topic, well, we're going to have participants download our extension in a first survey. We then ask them attitudes and intents questions. So what is your attitude towards tracking, or what is your intent to use something like private browsing mode? The participant, after downloading the extension, uses it for a period of 1 week and then is invited back to survey 2, where we re-ask the same attitudes and intents questions and also ask the user to pull up the visualizations that are in their extension and answer per visualization questions about them. I'll note that we had 200 participants in total. So a few limitations before our results. It's important to know that we have a convenience sample. We use prolific, so there are certain biases that are associated with prolific, and we just have to acknowledge those biases, right? Participants may be younger and more educated and more tech savvy than the general population. Along those same lines, we built this browser extension that is very privacy invasive, and we were very clear to participants that these are all the things that this extension does. So it's a certain type of person might be interested in these visualizations and this type of data collection. And so it's important to note that our participants may have different privacy proclivities than the general population. Finally, many of our results are built on these inferences that we're learning about participants. We're not saying that somebody is actually interested in dogs and cats, even though the extension is saying that, and even though the results are built on that. These are just inferences. These are the types of inferences that trackers engage in, and it's important to know that these are inferences. So the two results that I'll focus on today. The first of these is how transparency affects privacy perceptions, and the second is how visualizations of transparency affect privacy perceptions. And I'll focus in this talk on creepiness. So before I talk about those, though, one of the things I said in the beginning was that we're trying to build this creepy version of TT1, right? And so we want a way to compare TT1 to TT2. We have these two conditions that I said were based on TT1, and we're going to compare those to TT2. The question that we're asking participants is their comfort with advertisers inferring their interest on the webpage they visit. So that type of inference engine that we built, a shadow model based on Google of. And what we're seeing is that participants in these TT1 conditions are more comfortable with that type of inferencing, that privacy invasive behavior, than participants in TT2. And so we can say that in some ways, TT2 is a creepy version that's making people more uncomfortable about tracking than TT1. All right, so looking at the use of private browsing mode, this is intent to use private browsing mode. We want to look at the differences between the start of the survey and the end of the survey. And when I say survey here, I just mean when participants did not use the extension, and then they used the extension for 1 week, and then we re-asked the same questions about their intent to use private browsing mode. And we can see that this is a stack bar Likert of the same type of information. And so you can see these greens and this yellow are participants saying they're more intending to use private browsing mode, and the blues are less intent to use it. And so all this chart is showing us is that there is this desire to use private browsing mode more after TT2 has been used versus before. And that was a statistically significant result. So the first finding, transparency it changes our attitude and intents toward privacy. The second finding that we wanted to dig into was the way visualizations affect privacy propensities. And here we're going to ask a question per visualization, whether a visualization is creepy or not creepy. And this is a Likert scale. And so the greens and the yellow are going to be more creepy and the blues are going to be less creepy. And what we find is that there is this nice distribution of more creepy visualizations to less creepy visualizations. Some of these are up to 66% of participants said that this visualization was creepy. And on the other hand, some participants said, okay, only 37% found this visually creepy. But this was somewhat surprising to us because even like 66% is not as high as we thought it might be. And so we wanted to dig into this and we wanted to look at whether data was the reason why participants were feeling differently. So if we look at the average bedtime that a person might have in that late night engagement visual, what we might expect to see is that some participants who have late bedtimes based on the social norm around bedtimes are saying that this visualization is creepier than participants with earlier bedtimes. And this was not the case. Our data was all over the place in terms of participants finding some things creepy and some things not creepy. And so the second finding is that creepiness is not a universal concept. Lots of things are creepy, but particular things, it's hard to reach agreement on. Okay, so in summary, we did a 200-person longitudinal survey of tracking transparency. We found that transparency increases discomfort with interest inferencing, and it increases people's intent to use private browsing mode. At the same time, tracking is uncomfortable, but it's not universally uncomfortable. So it's hard to say that there are certain visualizations or certain tracking practices that are universally agreed upon. It's a very subjective concept. And I'll stop here for questions. Thank you.